There is a house at the end of a quiet street in a small town in Ohio, the kind of street where the mailboxes lean slightly and the maple trees have been there longer than most of the marriages. In that house lives a woman named Margaret Dunlap, though almost no one has called her that in 50 years. To her neighbors, her children, and the one stubborn friend who has outlived nearly everyone else she knew in 1962, she is simply Maggie. Maggie is 78 years old. She has silver hair she still sets in curlers on Sunday nights out of habit more than vanity, and hands that have grown a little unsteady, though not so unsteady that she has stopped using them. She wears cardigans in every season because she is always slightly cold, and she keeps a radio on the kitchen counter tuned to a station that plays the kind of music nobody makes anymore. This is the story of what Maggie did the year she turned 78. It is not a dramatic story. Nobody was rescued. No fortune changed hands, but it is the story of a door that had been closed for almost 7 decades, and what happened the year Maggie finally decided to open it. To understand why the door mattered, you have to go back to 1957, to a 4th-grade classroom in the same small town, where a 9-year-old girl named Margaret handed in a painting of a barn caught in a rainstorm. Her teacher, a woman named Mrs. Ferris, held that painting up in front of the entire class and said, "Now this is how you capture light." For one afternoon, Margaret floated. She went home and announced to her mother, who was standing at the stove with her back turned, that she was going to be an artist. Her mother did not turn around. She said, "That's nice, Margaret. Now go set the table." She grew up. She married a man named Frank, a good man, patient and steady, who worked at the hardware store his father had started and never once raised his voice at her in 41 years of marriage. She had 3 children. She took a job at the local school district office, typing enrollment forms and filing student records, and she did that job for 31 years, competently and without complaint. By any reasonable measure, Maggie built a full life. She was, by every outward account, a woman who did not want for anything. But there was a room inside her, this is how she would later describe it, to her daughter, and eventually to no one in particular. Just to the empty kitchen in the morning's single room, she kept the door shut on. It held the paints she never bought, the classes she never took, the 9-year-old girl who once floated home believing she had captured light. She told herself for years that she would get to that room eventually, after the children were grown, after the mortgage was paid off, after Frank retired, after the grandchildren no longer needed rides to soccer practice. 86. Frank died 3 years ago, quietly in his sleep, the way he seemed to do most things. The children, all grown now with children and grandchildren of their own, called on Sundays and visited when they could. The grandchildren stopped needing rides anywhere, and one ordinary morning last spring, Maggie stood in her kitchen and understood, all at once, that every excuse she had been saving the room for had finally run out. There was no more after left to hide behind. There was only now, and she was the only one left who could turn the handle. So in March, at 78 years old, Maggie drove herself to the craft store on the edge of town and bought a beginner's set of oil paints for $42. The girl at the register, who could not have been older than 20, looked at the purchase and asked, kindly enough, whether the paints were a gift for a grandchild. Maggie told her no, they were for herself. The girl smiled the particular smile people reserve for the elderly when they believe an old woman has gotten a little confused. Maggie did not correct her. She simply took her paints home. It was her daughter Ellen who eventually found her out, on an ordinary Sunday visit, discovering the folded easel behind the pantry door where it had been hidden like contraband. Ellen stood in the doorway with her mouth open and asked her mother how long she had been painting. When Maggie told her since March, Ellen asked the question that would stay with Maggie longer than she expected. Why had she never told any of them that she wanted this? Maggie did not have a good answer that day, and in truth, she still does not have a complete one now. But in the month since, sitting at her kitchen table with a brush in her hand, she has turned the question over many times, and she has come to some conclusions worth telling. She thinks often of a woman from her church, a friend named Dottie Ransom, who is gone now but whose story Maggie still tells anyone willing to listen. Dottie took up the piano at 81 years old, shortly after burying her own husband of 52 years. Instead of folding into grief, as everyone quietly expected and would have forgiven, Dottie bought a second-hand upright piano and began taking lessons from a 19-year-old boy who taught out of his parents' garage. 2 years later, at her granddaughter's wedding, Dottie played Clair de Lune for the gathered family. She played it badly. This detail matters to Maggie, and she insists on including it whenever she tells the story. The playing was not impressive, but people cried anyway because what they were watching was not a piano recital. It was a woman who had decided, at 81, that her story had not finished being written. Maggie believes something happens to people in this country once they cross a certain age, something quiet and rarely spoken aloud but deeply felt. She believes older people are treated, gently but persistently, as though the interesting part of their story has already concluded and they are simply living out an epilogue, waiting to be tied up neatly. She notices it in small things. The slower voices people use in grocery stores, the joking greeting cards about being over the hill. The fact that people ask an old woman how she is feeling far more often than they ask her what she is working on, as though feeling were the only verb left available to her. The barn painting Maggie began last March is still unfinished. She works on it most mornings, coffee first, then her brushes. By her own admission, it is not very good. The perspective is slightly wrong, the light falls incorrectly across the roofline, and when Ellen first saw it she asked, not unkindly, whether it was meant to be a barn or a boat. Maggie laughed when she told that story. She was not offended. She has stopped needing the painting to be good. She only needs it to be hers. What she has discovered, standing at that easel most mornings, is that when the brush is in her hand, she is simultaneously 9 years old and 78 years old, and there is no longer any gap between those two selves. The door she kept shut for almost 70 years turned out to be, in the end, just a door. It opened the way doors do. She has admitted, more than once, that she cannot quite explain why she believed for so long that it would be harder to open than it was. She does not tell this story to convince anyone to buy oil paints. She is careful about that. She understands that for someone else, the closed room might hold something else entirely, a language never learned, a marriage that needs repairing, an apology owed for 30 years, a business idea repeatedly talked out of existence, or simply the quiet permission to want something out loud without immediately apologizing for it. Frank used to tease her, gently, for overthinking everything, and she will be the first to admit he was rarely wrong about that. She has now spent the better part of a year overthinking a barn caught in a rainstorm. But some mornings, when the light comes through her kitchen window at just the right angle, she says she forgets to overthink anything at all. She simply paints. And in those minutes, she is not an old woman quietly waiting for an ending. She is only a woman painting a barn in the rain, exactly as her teacher once told her she could, back when she was 9 years old and the whole of her life still stretched out ahead of her, unclaimed and unhurried. Frank used to tease her, gently, for overthinking everything, and she will be the first to admit he was rarely wrong about that. She has now spent the better part of a year overthinking a barn caught in a rainstorm. But some mornings, when the light comes through her kitchen window at just the right angle, she says she forgets to overthink anything at all. She simply paints. And in those minutes, she is not an old woman quietly waiting for an ending. She is only a woman painting a barn in the rain, exactly as her teacher once told her she could, back when she was 9 years old and the whole of her life still stretched out ahead of her, unclaimed and unhurried. That is where this story leaves her not finished, not resolved, simply continuing. Most mornings, if you were to knock on the door of that house at the end of the quiet street in Ohio, you would find Margaret Dunlap standing at a small easel in her kitchen, brush in hand. Working on a painting she began at 78 years old and has no particular plan to hurry. She would likely tell you, without turning around, that she has work to do.